There's a version of Abraham Lincoln that almost everyone knows. Tall, gaunt, top hat. The great emancipator. The man who saved the Union. His face on the penny, on Mount Rushmore, staring out from 100 classroom walls with that expression that looks like it belongs to someone who already knows how the story ends. That version isn't wrong exactly. It just leaves out almost everything interesting. Lincoln was a self-educated man from genuine poverty who taught himself law by firelight, became one of the sharpest legal minds in Illinois, and navigated the most catastrophic political crisis in American history with a combination of patience, shrewdness, and moral clarity that most of his contemporaries didn't recognize until it was too late to stop him. He was funny, genuinely funny, in a dry, story-driven way that disarmed people constantly. He was also deeply melancholic, prone to what his friends called the hippo, what we'd probably call depression. And he carried it his entire life without ever letting it undo him. He didn't start out as an abolitionist. He wasn't a saint. He made compromises that still disturb people today, and he died before he could see what his choices had actually built, or whether they'd hold. That's the Lincoln worth knowing. He was born in 1809 in a log cabin in Kentucky, not as a metaphor for humble beginnings, but literally a one-room log cabin with a dirt floor in a part of the frontier where survival required everything a family had. His father, Thomas, was a farmer who kept moving. Kentucky, then Indiana, then Illinois, partly chasing opportunity, partly running from land disputes he couldn't win. His mother, Nancy Hanks Lincoln, died when Abraham was 9. Milk sickness, they called it, a disease caused by drinking milk from cows that had eaten white snake root. His sister Sarah died in childbirth 9 years later. By the time Lincoln was a young man, he'd already learned that the people you love disappear without warning. His stepmother, Sarah Bush Johnston, is one of the underappreciated figures in his life. She pushed him to read, recognized something in him that his father apparently didn't, and the warmth between them lasted until his death. Thomas Lincoln and his son had a difficult, distant relationship. Lincoln almost didn't attend his father's funeral. He had roughly 18 months of formal schooling across his entire childhood. Everything else he taught himself: grammar, mathematics, law, rhetoric, by borrowing books and reading them until he'd absorbed them. He read the King James Bible and Aesop's fables so many times that their rhythms became his own. You can hear it in every speech he ever gave. He moved to New Salem, Illinois in his early 20s, worked as a store clerk, postmaster, and land surveyor, and studied law on his own. He passed the bar in 1836 without attending law school. Within a few years, he was one of the most sought-after trial lawyers in the state, riding the 8th Judicial Circuit across central Illinois, sleeping in shared rooms at roadside taverns, and building the kind of political intelligence that only comes from knowing hundreds of ordinary people by name. The myth compresses all of this into self-made man rises from poverty. The reality is longer and stranger, a life shaped by loss, displacement, and an almost obsessive drive to become something, though Lincoln himself wasn't always sure what. Lincoln entered politics as a Whig, which was the party of economic modernization, infrastructure, banks, tariffs, industrial development. He served 4 terms in the Illinois state legislature and 1 term in Congress, where he made the mistake of criticizing the Mexican-American War and came home to find his political career stalled. For roughly 5 years in the early 1850s, he stepped back from politics and focused on law. Then, the Kansas-Nebraska Act happened. The act, passed in 1854, effectively reopened the question of whether slavery could spread into new territories, a question many people had assumed was settled. Lincoln was galvanized, not because he'd suddenly become a radical abolitionist, but because he saw the act as a moral and constitutional corruption that threatened the founding premise of the country. His position at this stage was complicated and worth being precise about. He believed slavery was wrong, morally, categorically, clearly wrong. He also believed the Constitution, as written, protected it where it already existed, that he had no legal authority to touch it in the southern states, and that the immediate priority was preventing its expansion. He was skeptical of full racial equality in the way most white men of his era were, and he said so honestly in his 1858 debates with Stephen Douglas. He also changed. The Lincoln of 1865 was not the Lincoln of 1858, and the trajectory of that change is one of the most important things about him. He gave speech after speech in the mid-1850s, laying out what he believed. The logic was patient and cumulative. Slavery, he argued, was incompatible with the Declaration of Independence's claim that all men are created equal. That claim wasn't just rhetoric. It was the moral foundation the entire American experiment rested on. If you hollowed it out to protect an economic interest, you hadn't just compromised policy. You'd demolished the argument for self-government itself. The Cooper Union Address in February 1860, given in New York to an audience that didn't know him, is perhaps the best single demonstration of how his mind worked. He spent months researching the original framers' views on federal authority over slavery in the territories. He assembled the evidence methodically, acknowledged every counterargument, and dismantled it. By the end, the audience that had come curious left convinced. It's essentially a legal brief delivered as a public speech, and it made him a viable presidential candidate. He won the 1860 election without carrying a single Southern state. By the time he was inaugurated in March 1861, 7 states had already seceded. The Civil War began 6 weeks later. What followed is 4 years of Lincoln making decisions under conditions that would have broken most people. He suspended habeas corpus. He arrested editors and political opponents. He overrode generals, replaced generals, promoted generals no one else believed in. He pushed the Emancipation Proclamation through in January 1863, not as a complete moral statement, since it only freed enslaved people in Confederate states and left border state slavery intact, but as a military and political act that changed the meaning of the war. He knew it was incomplete. He said so. He pushed for the 13th Amendment, which would do the complete work, and lobbied for it with everything he had. The second inaugural address, delivered in March 1865 with the war nearly over, is the closest thing to a philosophical statement Lincoln left. It doesn't gloat. It doesn't claim that the North was righteous and the South was evil. It acknowledges that both sides had read the same Bible and prayed to the same God, and suggests that the war, with all its carnage, might have been something like a divine reckoning for the national sin of slavery. Then it ends with, "Malice toward none, charity for all." Whatever you think about Lincoln, that speech is extraordinary. Lincoln became a legend partly because he was assassinated 5 days after the Confederate surrender, at the precise moment when his meaning could be frozen in place before the complications could accumulate. He suspended civil liberties during wartime in ways that alarmed even his allies. He authorized the detention of journalists, shut down opposition newspapers, and imprisoned political critics without trial. His defenders argue the survival of the Union justified it. His critics point out that's exactly what every leader who suspends civil liberties argues. The question has never been cleanly resolved. His evolution on racial equality was genuine, but slow. And the things he said about race in the 1850s don't disappear because he later grew. In the 1858 debates with Stephen Douglas, he stated plainly that he didn't favor social or political equality between white and black Americans. He said it calmly, more than once, in front of crowds who needed to hear it to keep voting for him. He was almost certainly saying what he needed to say. He was also saying what he, at that point, believed. The great emancipator framing, while not false, tends to center white political will and push to the margins the black Americans who actually drove the pressure. The abolitionists, the freedom fighters, the enslaved people who ran toward Union lines the moment they could, who pushed, pressured, and sometimes forced the direction Lincoln eventually took. Frederick Douglass, who knew Lincoln personally, called him in 1876 the white man's president, a man who came to emancipation through political necessity as much as moral conviction. It's the most honest assessment Lincoln received from someone in a position to give it. Now, the part of Lincoln's legacy that gets the least attention, even in critical retellings. While the Civil War was being fought in the East and South, a separate, much older conflict was continuing on the western frontier. The United States had been displacing, confining, and killing Native American peoples for decades before Lincoln took office, and his administration didn't interrupt that. It accelerated it. The Homestead Act of 1862, celebrated as one of Lincoln's great democratic achievements, opened millions of acres of western land to white settlers. That land was not empty. It belonged, by treaty or by long habitation, to indigenous nations. The act essentially legislated dispossession at scale, flooding territories with settlers and making the pressure on native communities sudden and overwhelming. The Pacific Railway Act, also 1862, authorized the Transcontinental Railroad. The railroad would cut directly through the Great Plains, through the heart of Lakota and Cheyenne and Arapaho territory. Lincoln understood what railroads did to landscapes and economies. That was the whole point. What they did to the people already living in those landscapes was understood too, and treated as a cost worth paying. The most direct confrontation happened in Minnesota. In the summer of 1862, the Dakota people, the Santee Sioux, rose in armed conflict against the United States after years of treaty violations, withheld annuity payments, and deliberate starvation. Federal agents had refused to distribute food to Dakota families who were starving, reportedly telling them to eat grass. The uprising was desperate and violent. Hundreds of white settlers were killed. The U.S. military response was swift and overwhelming. After the fighting ended, military tribunals convicted 303 Dakota men of murder and other offenses, many in trials that lasted minutes. The process was, by any honest standard, not a legal proceeding. It was a military formality designed to produce executions. Lincoln reviewed the trial records. He reduced the list from 303 to 38, applying a rough standard of distinguishing fighters from those convicted of murdering civilians. He was trying, in some sense, to impose restraint on a process designed to have none. Those 38 men were hanged simultaneously on December 26, 1862, in Mankato, Minnesota. It remains the largest mass execution in American history. Lincoln signed the order. The remaining Dakota, including women, children, and elderly people who had played no part in the fighting, were expelled from Minnesota entirely. Thousands were marched to a barren internment camp on the Missouri River at Crow Creek, South Dakota, where hundreds died of disease and starvation in the following months. The U.S. government placed bounties on Dakota scalps. Lincoln did not intervene. In the Southwest, Lincoln's administration oversaw the forced removal of the Navajo people, the Long Walk of 1864, in which thousands of Navajos were marched 300 miles to a desolate reservation called Bosque Redondo. Hundreds died on the march. Hundreds more died in the years of captivity that followed, in conditions the government knew were unsurvivable. The man who argued that the Declaration of Independence applied to all human beings, who said its promise was meant to expand, not contract, over time, presided over policies that treated entire peoples as obstacles to be cleared. That's not an irony that resolves neatly. It's a contradiction that sits at the center of American history, not just Lincoln's biography. Part of why this gets less attention than his record on slavery is that indigenous suffering operates differently in American historical memory. There's no equivalent of the Emancipation Proclamation to point to, no redemptive turn, no 13th Amendment, no moment where Lincoln extended the logic of human equality toward Native peoples the way he eventually extended it toward Black Americans. The story doesn't arc toward redemption. It just ends in displacement and death, and then continues long after Lincoln is gone. The private Lincoln, depression, 2 lost sons, a turbulent marriage, is the stuff of biography. This is the stuff of history. Lincoln's most durable legacy is probably the 13th Amendment, ratified 8 months after his death, which abolished slavery in the United States. Everything he said and did was in service of that outcome, even when the path toward it was indirect. He also established something important about democratic leadership under pressure, that it's possible to hold a complex, evolving position, to be wrong about some things and right about others, to make compromises without losing the thread of what you're actually doing, and to explain yourself to ordinary people without condescending to them. His writing is a model of clarity, not simplicity, clarity. There's a difference. He never confused difficult ideas with obscure language. The question his life poses now is about moral progress and its pace. Lincoln moved. He changed. The Lincoln who in 1858 said he didn't favor Black Americans serving on juries was the same man who, in his last public speech in 1865, endorsed limited black suffrage, which was radical enough to prompt John Wilkes Booth, who was in the crowd, to decide that Lincoln had to die. Whether that movement was fast enough, whether it required the catastrophic pressure of 600,000 deaths to accomplish what moral argument alone couldn't, these aren't comfortable questions, and they're not resolved. Lincoln matters not as an answer, but as a demonstration that political leadership can contain genuine moral development. He was a man who made enormous decisions under impossible pressure, knew he might be wrong, and acted anyway. That's rarer than it sounds in someone with that much power. Whether that counts as courage or just necessity depends on what you think leadership actually requires.